Professor Ángel Lopez is a professor of economics at the Technical University in Cartagena in Spain. He's also Vice Chancellor of Staff and Teaching Innovation at that university. He has published extensively in his field of economics, not least on the topic of the day, the importance of prices in the propensity to start or quit smoking and the usefulness of taxation, which is the main topic today. Professor Lopez, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction. And first and foremost, thank you very much for inviting me to Iceland to this very interesting workshop on tobacco and taxes and tobacco products. Obviously, I will be talking about tobacco taxation today, as the title of my presentation reads. But I want to start this talk by drawing your attention to some data. This is data on the prevalence of daily smoking. And I didn't know about this till I started doing a bit of research for this talk today. But, I was really nicely surprised to see that, in Iceland, you have been able to reduce prevalence by 10 points, starting from 20, which is already a low level in comparison to other regions. Yeah, so that's a 50% drop starting from an already low level. And then when I compare this data to what we have in the European Union, or more concretely what we have in Spain, I thought, what the hell am I going to say in Iceland that they don't already know? I mean, how can I possibly say anything of interest to these people who've already managed to do so well in terms of tobacco smoking prevalence? But then I thought, okay, let's see whether we can, come up with something interesting. Okay, so I thought, okay, I'm going to start by trying to see whether there are any factors that explain why we have not been able to achieve a comparable success in the European Union. And bear with me the fact that the European Union is a very heterogeneous region. We have countries like Spain, or some Eastern European countries where prevalence is relatively high. And also you have countries like the Scandinavian countries where prevalence is comparable perhaps to what you have in Iceland. But I thought, okay, there's no way that we can, go through every single country in the European Union, so I'm going to talk about aggregates today. And I think it's relevant to do so because the whole of the European Union is bound by common legislation, at least a basic framework on tobacco taxes. And this is something that is currently being reviewed, so it's interesting to see whether we can get some lessons from what has been happening in the past, in the recent past. So I'm going to start by showing you some patterns of tobacco consumption of the last, I think it's about the last, the period between 2004 and 2015, 2015 being the latest year for which we have definite figures. So what we see here is that there has been a drop in tobacco consumption, total tobacco consumption. And when I talk about total tobacco consumption, I'm referring to the sum of the two main tobacco products nowadays in the European Union, which are manufactured cigarettes and roll your own tobacco or make your own tobacco, okay? I know that there are other products, but they are relatively marginal, in the whole picture, okay? Although for some countries, of course, again, they may be important. So we see a drop of 24% in the total consumption of those two products, okay? But this drop may be divided into two components. One, largest drop in the total consumption of manufactured cigarettes, but at the same time, we see a relatively even higher increase in the consumption of roll-your-own tobacco. Okay? Now, it is true that the aggregate is a drop, but something which we don't really like is happening at the same time. Yeah. Okay. So we can have a look at what's been happening year by year. This is the yearly rate of change in tobacco consumption. So the red line, there is showing us year on year how much cigarette consumption was, the blue line, how much cigarette consumption was changing, and we can see that it's negative for most of the period. So every year, cigarette consumption was going down, but at the same time, roll-your-own consumption was going up. And, on some occasions, with very huge increases on a yearly basis, okay? So it's not something that has happened only 1 year. It's been a, constant pattern in the, over the period, okay? And what we can see is that by 2015, it seems that the rates of change of the two products are nearly zero. So, that raises a question, which is, have reductions in sales stopped? We don't know. We need to have a bit more perspective to see what's happening there. But, that seems to be the situation as far as the data that we can work with tell us, right? Now, on one hand, we have a total drop in tobacco consumption, but we can see that there's been an increase in the consumption of one new product or newish product. Okay, so this, of course, generates mixed feelings. On one hand, we are happy because there's been a drop, but this phenomenon of switching to roll your own, I think it's something to worry about. And this raises, I think, important questions. On one hand, we say, well, could we have done better over the last decade? Okay, was the last decade a lost opportunity to abate prevalence in the European Union? And so, approach ourselves to what has been happening, for instance, in Iceland, okay? And, well, if that's the case, and I have my contention here is that it has been a lost decade in terms of, realizing more health gains. If so, how can it be corrected, okay? Now, I think that economists should be very modest when trying to, make forecasts about what's going to happen and how to correct things in the future. We have, failed miserably on, recent occasions concerning the economic crisis. So, it's a risky business to go into forecast. But at least what we can do is, look back to the past and try to explain what's happened. Okay, and I think that economists, that's really what they're good at. We are good at. Okay, if we are good at anything. Okay, so I'm going to try to kind of dissect the evidence in order to come up with a tentative story, of what's happened. So, and for that, you're going to allow me to take a bit of a detour into the economics of the tobacco industry. And, of course, I will not go into very complex details because that's not the point of today's talk. But, there are some things that we need to know about the economics of the tobacco industry. The first thing to note is that a very concentrated industry. It's what we economists call an oligopoly, which means that a small number of firms serve the existing demand, okay? For instance, I'm going to show you some data here. This is the structure of demand for cigarettes in Spain, okay? And basically, if you sum these percentages here, you will get a figure of 99%, okay? So that means that 4 firms serve the totality, or nearly the totality, of the market in Spain. So that's, you know, a classic oligopoly. And these are the brands that these firms, the main brands for these firms, okay? So, you know, it's very far from what we call a perfectly competitive market, okay? The other thing is that in this industry you have what economists call large economies of scale. Now, what does this mean? It means that, you know, the structure of production for these firms is such that you have a very, very high fixed cost, you know, big factories, large distribution networks, and a very, very small, nearly negligible marginal cost of production. It means that, you know, to produce an extra pack of cigarettes costs almost nothing once you've accounted for the large fixed costs that, you know, that you've already paid, okay? Now, with these characteristics, you know, without going into, you know, formal proofs or anything, we know, and this is, you know, what industrial economics is good at, you know, to, you know, try to characterize the structure of industries and, you know, tell you about how pricing decisions are going to be. We know that the differences in the retail price of products do not have a lot to do with differences in the costs of production, okay? In a way, what it means is that firms have got pricing power. They are able to set prices according to their maximizing profits objectives, okay? They are not price takers, which is what you would do if you were in a perfectly competitive market, where many firms compete for the same demand, and therefore you're not free to set prices because you would lose your custom, okay? So, given these circumstances, we may ask ourselves, well, what explains the differences in retail prices between tobacco products, okay? This is a very important phenomenon. This is brand segmentation, okay? I'm going to show you again some data. And this is, you know, this is current data for Spain. I just downloaded this from the webpage for the Tobacco Commission in Spain. And this is showing us that, well, we have, let's say, 5 brands, 5 price ranges in the Spanish market for cigarettes. Super premium, premium, sub-premium, discount, deep discount, okay? So, you know, the super premium range would be occupied by brands like Dunhill, okay, at 5.5 euro per pack. And we can go down the price range and find brands like this not so well-known Excite here, which sells for about 3.95 euro. So, does it mean that producing these cigarettes costs differently and therefore retail prices are different? No. They all cost the same, basically. In many cases, the product is very similar, even the same type of, you know, tobacco. It's just a marketing strategy, okay? You want to cater for customers with high willingness to pay and low willingness to pay. You don't want to leave anybody out, okay? And that, you know, allows you to maximize your profits. But, you know, it doesn't really stop there because, you know, what we see is that, you know, this degree of price differentiation goes even deeper. There is within product, within brand segmentation, okay? So again, this is data for Spain, and this is all the varieties of Marlboro cigarettes that you can buy, okay? And look at this. We go from 4.55, which is the most popular variety of Marlboro, up to 5.05, okay? So again, you know, within Marlboro, there are people who want to pay more and people who want to pay less. Of course, you don't want to leave anybody out, okay? So, you know, that's another marketing strategy that companies have. By the way, this is not specific to the tobacco industry. You see this type of marketing strategies in other industries. Let's say cars. I mean, how many varieties of Volkswagen Golf do you find? Well, Volkswagen Super, Extra, Medium, whatever. And then if you go into different extras that, you know, a particular brand of car may have, like, you know, top range, medium range, or low range, okay, this is basically the same strategy, okay, to cater for all the possible willingness or abilities to pay. Now, okay, what are the limits to this strategy on behalf of tobacco companies? Okay, limits to segmentation. Well, I don't know if you know this guy. He's a well-known actor, and this picture is taken from one of his films. I think it's Hannibal, okay? And why am I showing Hannibal here? Because there is something in marketing and in economics called cannibalization, okay, which is not a nice word, but I think it's a rightly chosen word in economics to describe this phenomenon, which is, okay, if you start segmenting prices and differentiating your product and it is still the same product, eventually consumers are going to realize, and they're going to say, I'm not a fool, I'm just going to go for the cheap version. Okay, so in marketing, cannibalization means that a product from an inferior segment, price segment, starts eating away at the sales of a product of a superior segment. Okay, so firms will try to do that up to this point. They want to stop this process of cannibalization. And that's why, they're always trying to make consumers think that what they sell are different products. Okay, they're trying to differentiate their products. And this is something that, is done by means of not only product innovation, by, kind of renewing your product range every now and then, but also by spending a lot of money on advertising. Okay, so tobacco companies have got huge advertising budgets in order to preserve premium status. Okay, and by the way, although this is not today's topic, this is why it's so important to have plain packaging, because the main advertising vehicle nowadays in many countries that have banned advertising from the usual media is through the packaging, okay? So, this is horrific, for a tobacco company which wants to preserve this premium status. Okay, if you cannot even brand yourself using the tobacco pack, what can you do? Okay, so that is why they're going to fight with all their power to avoid this. Okay? So of course that is one limit to segmentation. And the other limit has to do with what this guy here, who is Benjamin Franklin, said. He's got a lot of economists know this phrase. I don't know if you've heard about this phrase before, but he said something like, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes, okay? So we are now going to taxes, right? So minimum quantity taxes. This is a very important instrument in order to affect the retail price of tobacco products. Because what these minimum quantity taxes do is basically they set a floor to the retail price at which products may be sold without losing money. Okay? So, in fact, this type of taxes are so important. I mean, there's plenty of evidence on how important they are. I'm going to show you some recent evidence here. What we have here is a scatter of points representing the retail price of the most, well, this would be something called the weighted average price, which is the price of the average pack of cigarettes for the countries of the European Union between 2011 and 2015. So this would be the scatter of points. On the vertical axis, we've got the weighted average price for each country for each year, and on the horizontal axis, we've got the amount of minimum tax that they bear, that they apply in each of these countries. Okay, and what we see is that we get a nearly perfect explanation. So the variation in prices in this across time, over time, and across space, okay, is nearly perfectly explained by the variation in minimum taxes. Okay, so this is, if you want to know what creates differences in prices, you've got to look for differences in taxes, as this data is here showing you. Okay? So this would be evidence for the whole of the European Union. I'm going to show you evidence for my country, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of what happened in Spain. In 2005, okay, so each of these boxes is showing you the distribution of retail price of cigarettes. Okay, so this would be like a histogram looked from above. Okay, so this would be the upper quartile, this would be the lower quartile, and this would be the outliers of the distribution, and this line here would be the median of the distribution. Okay, so for each of these years we have, I don't know, maybe 500 data points. Okay, and this would be the distribution of these data points which represent prices. Okay, so in 2005, a total advertising ban was introduced. Okay? Of course, if you cannot compete by advertising, what can you compete on? Prices. Okay? So, before the actual ban came into effect, tobacco companies launched themselves into a price war. And that is why we see that the lower end of the price distribution went down just before 2005. Okay? Everybody started to say, well, this can't go on like this. Tobacco prices are cheaper and cheaper by the day. This is going to make young people start smoking. Nobody's going to quit. What can we do about this? Well, they started searching for recipes, and eventually they found somebody who told us, well, what you have to do is to introduce minimum quantity taxes. Okay? And they did so in the middle of 2006. Okay? And we see that the effect of these minimum taxes was the right one, because basically they lifted the low price spectrum. Okay, so you can see that here, this is all, of course, constant prices. Okay, taking into account the effect of inflation. So you can see here that the lower end of the price spectrum was much greater than in previous year. So this is evidence that this type of taxes had the right effect, had the intended effect. Okay, so we've got a lot of evidence telling us that this is the right way to deal with low prices. Okay, so right. So I'm going to go back now to what has happened in the European Union, okay, after giving you this little detour into economics. And I'm going to talk here about the relationship between football and tobacco taxes. Now, bear with me, those of you who don't like football, okay? It won't be for too long. I'm going to show you a picture of a very well-known football player. He died sadly recently. Johan Cruyff, a Dutch player, played for the Dutch national team for Barcelona, Ajax, and so on. Now, besides being one of the best players, football players in the world, he was well known also for his phrases. Yeah, he had these catchphrases that made him famous, and one of them was, "Every disadvantage has its advantage." Now, this is like a stupid sentence in a way. Yeah, of course, What do you mean by that, Johan? Well, some football pundits have tried to interpret what he said, yeah, and they say, well, when you're playing football, if you deploy your effectives, trying to cover one side of the ground, then you're going to create spaces on the other side, and vice versa. If the team is pressing forward, they leave some space backwards, and then you can attack and counterattack, just football tactics, okay? But now, well, it turns out that this has a parallel with what's happened with tobacco taxes in the European Union and in the case of Spain. This is just the graph that I showed you before, okay? So minimum tobacco taxes, minimum cigarette taxes, by the way, okay, were shifting upwards the price distribution, but they were creating opportunities at these lower prices. And that's exactly what tobacco companies took advantage of, okay? They could not sell cigarettes at these prices here. Well, let's sell something else. Let's sell other products that are not subject to the same levels of taxation, okay? So, really, if you want an answer for what's been happening with cigarettes and roll your own in the European Union, well, the answer would be, it's because of prices, okay? And this graph here is telling you the difference between the median price of cigarettes in the European Union and the median price of a pack of, let's say, 20 units of, or 20 rolled your own cigarettes, okay? Under the assumption that you need 0.7 grams of tobacco to roll a cigarette, okay? So you can see that while cigarette prices were going up between 2004 and 2005, roll-your-own prices remained mostly flat for most of the period. They only had a bit of a hike here towards the end of the period. And in fact, the price gap between the two types of products was greater at the end of the period, 2.16 euro per 20 sticks, than at the start of the period. So it is really no surprise that we have seen the shifts in the consumption of tobacco products over this period. Okay. And of course, after having gone into the economics of the tobacco industry and how prices are determined, we can say that it has to do with taxation, okay? Because in all European countries, roll your own has been taxed at a much lighter rate than cigarettes. And this has happened everywhere, okay, from, high tax countries and to low tax countries. In fact, the median tax gap for 20 sticks was with data but for 2015 was 1.25 euro. Okay, so this is the, what's happened. Okay, so we can say that this is not particularly, we shouldn't be given particularly good marks to European Union governments in terms of implementation of the Article 6 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which deals with taxes, okay? And in fact, one of the recommendations of the WHO in terms of implementing this article is that literally all tobacco products should be taxed in a comparable way, in particular where the risk of substitution exists. Okay? So this would be a fail, yeah, for European Union governments. And a restatement of this sentence is that, well, parties should ensure that tax systems minimize incentives to shift to cheaper products in the same product category. And I guess that they have done rightly by minimizing the chances of substitution within cigarettes, okay, as we have seen the price distribution of cigarettes was compressed, and you know what I have shown you for Spain is typical of many other countries in the European Union, but they haven't done so with respect to a slightly different product, which is roll your own tobacco or make your own tobacco. Now, I have to say in this regard that if we were evaluating Iceland, instead of a fail mark, we would be giving a pass with honors mark, because I was told just you know, at the start of the session today that you have recently equalized or you know gone a long way towards equalizing the tax burden between cigarettes and roll your own tobacco in Iceland as of January this year. So you know, maybe we have a you know a good leader to look at in the case of Iceland. Okay, so what can be done? Well, it's very easy. I mean, this is no mystery. Okay, so in terms of domestic policies, member states have actually the power to eliminate this tax advantage for roll your own tobacco. Okay, and I should add that the same that may happen for roll your own tobacco happens for the so-called borderline products. Okay, like cigarillos and cigars. There are some types of cigarillos in the Spanish market which are basically indistinguishable from cigarettes, and yet they are subject to a completely different taxation regime, okay? And of course, the industry is going to seize the opportunity to market them at low prices, okay? Okay, and you know, this is very simple to do, okay? Iceland has done something like this. So if you want to use an equivalence rate, let's say that, you know, a stick of roll your own tobacco takes about 0.7 grams, so basically equalized tax burden on a quantity basis, okay? So that there is no tax advantage, okay? So it's very simple, okay? Now, I was going to present this slide about the stance in Iceland, but of course this is obsolete, okay? Although it seems that in the past you've had this problem of people switching to roll your own, or at least this is what the media said a few years ago. So fortunately now you've addressed the problem. I hope that you know you don't have this to worry about anymore, okay? Right. As I was saying before, the European Union is considering a revision of the Tobacco Tax Directive. This is the legislation that provides a common framework for European Union countries in order to set their taxes on tobacco, okay? And one of the recommendations is to actually set measures that induce European Union members to equalize the minimum tax burden across products. But let me say that this is not the only problem that we have detected in the current structure of taxes in the European Union. And for that, I'm going to also take you a little bit into economics, but you know, I promise to be even more brief this time, okay? And I want to talk here about the difference between a pack of Marlboro and a Big Mac. And I know that that in Iceland you don't have McDonald's, but I think that you all know what a Big Mac is because you're a traveling country and you've been to other places. And maybe you've even had a Big Mac. Okay, so again, this is the distribution of the prices of a packet of Marlboro and the distribution of prices of a Big Mac. Okay, and this is data for, recent data, first quarter of 2017. Okay? Now, the first thing that we see in this graph is that the variation in prices for a pack of Marlboro is greater than the variation in prices of a Big Mac. Now, this is the so-called coefficient of variation. It's basically the standard distribution of the standard deviation of the distribution divided by the mean. It provides a measure of dispersion in relation to the mean of the distribution. And we can see that this is twice as much for Marlboro than for a Big Mac. Now, a pack of Marlboro is the same everywhere. A Big Mac is nearly the same everywhere, okay? So price differences across countries could reflect differences in costs of distribution, the costs of renting the premises where they sell these products, okay? And in this sense, a Big Mac is going to use more local inputs, okay? Because at least you've got to manufacture it at the burger joint, while the pack of Marlboro is already packed and you've only got to sell it at the retailer, right? So, if anything, we would expect the variation of prices of Big Macs to be greater than the variation of prices of a packet of Marlboro, okay? So why are Marlboro prices more unequal then? Again, it's taxes, right? Basically, this is showing you the distribution of prices of roll-your-own tobacco. This is the median, and this shaded area is the interquartile range, so that's where the bulk of the distribution of prices is, and this is doing the same thing for cigarettes, okay? And this is for year 2015. So what we see is that both for the case of roll-your-own tobacco and the case of cigarettes, there is a huge variation across countries within the European Union, okay? So not only there is a difference between roll-your-own and cigarettes, but within cigarettes and within roll-your-own. Okay, and this is another problem, because if we are in a single market and we are supposed to converge over time in the terms of trade and so on. Well, what we have seen for many other products, which is that prices across European countries tend to converge, we have not seen for tobacco products. And why is this a problem? Well, this is a problem because, on one hand, this is providing unequal health protection across different countries. So somebody who lives in the UK or Ireland or Denmark, their country, their government is protecting them by means of tobacco taxes much more than they are being protected in places like Spain or the Czech Republic. Okay, and I think that if we believe in this idea of Europe as a ever more integrating political space, well, this is one of the dimensions on which we should be converging, which is health protection. Okay, another thing is what we do from now on with the tensions with Brexit and nationalism kind of. Surging again in some places. But, if we still believe in this ideal of Europe, we should be worried about this. But of course, there is another problem here, which is the fact that, okay, I live in a high-tax country, my government is protecting me, but of course, if we are in a single market and people travel to and from, and, people can go to the neighboring country very easily, the tax policies of my neighbor may be undermining my own health policy, okay? And this is something, of course, that there is evidence about, and we know, for instance, that tobacco retailers in the south of France near the border with Spain, they don't sell as much as they should sell, and that is because people travel, they go into Spain and they buy much cheaper cigarettes there, and this happens, in other places of the European Union. So again, this has to do with the difference in tax levels applied by different governments across the European Union. Okay? So, again, what can be done? Well, and this is something that we have been working with. We have been putting forward a position paper coordinated by the Smoke-Free Partnership, which is an NGO based in Brussels, to which I believe that the Directorate of Health is affiliated, or at least has connections with. And, there is a position paper precisely addressing these two issues that we have discussed here. The difference between the taxes between roll your own and cigarettes, and the differences between tax levels for both products across the European Union. And this paper contains a relatively novel proposal which goes like this. The tax yield of tobacco products should at least equal 60% of an average retail price across the EU, so that this degree of dispersion of prices over different countries becomes smaller as time goes on. Okay? Right, so I'm nearly finishing, okay? So what next? I believe that the prescriptions that we've gone through about the main two combustible tobacco products are fairly uncontroversial among the public health community. And it's just a matter of trying to, promote these ideas so that they get into the financial, into the finance ministry head, yeah? And, they use these ideas whenever they set taxes. And of course, the European Commission adopts these recommendations or, equivalent recommendations. And I think, nobody would argue very strongly against this. If anything, people would have differences of, slight differences of what to do here, what to do there. But what about the so-called new generation products, okay? Well, we've got the e-cigarettes. I think that Charlotta is going to be talking about e-cigarettes today. I don't know whether you're going to talk about this new product, which is called heat not burn cigarettes or heat sticks. I mean, this is something between a standard cigarette and an e-cigarette, which is in the sense that it's got like a stick of tobacco inside, and there is something that heats this tobacco and releases an aerosol, okay? So in a way, something that is closer to the original cigarette than the e-cigarette. And this is something that is being marketed aggressively nowadays in places like Japan, okay? So what can, people who deal with taxes on tobacco products say about these new products? Okay, so this is my last detour into economics. You probably don't know who this guy is, right? But, economists, some economists know who he is. This guy is Angus Deaton. He is the winner of the 2015 Nobel Prize in Economics, okay? Now, he's written extensively on consumption, taxes, inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, and health inequalities. And he's got a nice book called The Great Escape, which basically, among other things, excuse me, among other things, he proposes a theory of, how humanity has escaped progressively from, different plagues over time, okay? Right. Angus Deaton acknowledges that the title of his book is based on this great movie, okay, The Great Escape. I don't know if you've watched this movie. To me, it's a far better movie than Hannibal, the one I showed you before. And of course, for those who haven't watched this movie, it's the story of a group of prisoners in a Nazi camp who try to escape by all means, okay? And one of the lead actors is Steve McQueen riding a huge motorcycle. Okay, so the Great Escape argument by Deaton is something that mostly people in public health, mostly doctors, I guess, are very familiar with, which is that health improvements are driven from new knowledge and then technologies that exploit this new knowledge, okay? And there are a few examples in the book, like, for instance, when people found out about the germ theory of disease, and then, they came up with technologies that, exploited this knowledge. So they came up with, clean water infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure, okay? So, and that, of course, avoided many, many, many deaths among infants, and, life expectancy shot up in the countries that applied these new innovations. Same goes on for more recent things like the use of statins to control the problems of high blood pressure, or things as simple as, oral rehydration for diarrhea, which is saving many lives in low-income countries. Okay, so it seems to me that with these new generation products, we have the technology before the knowledge, okay? And perhaps this is more so for the case of this new product that I mentioned before, the heat, not burn cigarettes. Because for e-cigarettes, there is, a lot of new evidence coming up about how dangerous they are in relationship with standard cigarettes. So the new knowledge that we need to, be more certain about is whether these new generation products are really reduced risk products, as the tobacco industry is quickly calling them, okay? Well, I don't really know if they are reduced risks, okay? And also, there is a lack of knowledge about how they interact with the patterns of consumption of combustible products, okay? And, perhaps you will prove me wrong in a while and you will come up with evidence about this problem here. But certainly, I don't know of, of a firm evidence base on which to ground a coherent tax policy here, okay? So, we have a problem here. We need more evidence, we need more knowledge. We have the technologies there. They could be, they could lead us to a very good scenario or to a very bad scenario, as Simon Chapman wrote in an article a few years ago, okay? But let me draw your attention to something that not so long ago, two economists and a lawyer wrote in this important journal here. Well, basically they had an editorial talking about differential taxes for differential risks, and they say something like, well, these technologies are here. It could well be the case that, differential tax treatment is appropriate, okay? And I guess that what they are suggesting that we should keep an open mind about this, okay? And try to explore whether these new technologies can create health gains, can, produce health gains without creating, health damage, okay? So, okay, I think this would be my way of concluding today. We are desperately seeking knowledge, And I want to finish by referring to this article. This is a revision of articles published in the field of tobacco control between 2000 and 2012 in Europe. And what these authors come up with is, a very stark finding, which is only 0.4% of 50,000 papers reviewed dealt with taxes and prices. So obviously there is a lack of research effort in that particular area, and also research up until 2012 at least, research is lagging behind the advent of these new generation products. So I guess my final thing today would be to say, well, we need to keep researching on how to devise a coherent tax framework for these new products. Okay? Well, thank you very much.